I've done a little bit of work in the oil and gas sector and in the electric power sector, working with embedded devices there. And my experience with, at least with the vendors that I've been working with, is that they do not make their firmware publicly available. It's very difficult to get that firmware. And so I'm wondering if you are making an implicit assumption here that the results that you're seeing in the publicly available firmware carries over into the privately held firmware. And the reason I ask that is because some of these vendors don't make their firmware publicly available because they are concerned about cybersecurity and they are practicing security through obscurity. But also, it could be that because they're more security conscious, their firmware may have more of these mitigators in it, but we don't know because we haven't analyzed it. Can you comment on that?
Oh, yes. So in terms of the publicly available firmware, so what we did is that anything they published on their website, we assume is publicly available. So we didn't try to hack their website or dig into the private data. So this is the reason we say it's publicly available. And again, I think it's okay for us to perform such a large-scale study because we are not trying to dig into the security problems of their firmwares. We are trying to protect them, right? So we are trying to indicate your firmware images are not well protected with such mitigations. We are not encouraging any of the attackers to explore those mitigations. Instead, we are trying to point out your devices should be improved. But anyway, if the vendors they contacting us saying like we don't want you to do such investigations, we will of course respect their opinions.
Yeah, that wasn't exactly my question. I was asking about can you take the results that you saw with the publicly available firmware, and if you were able to magically get a hold of all of the private firmware that you would have to hack the website to get, and I appreciate that you didn't do that, but if you were able to get all these privately held pieces of firmware, would you expect them to have the same rates or lack thereof of attack mitigation adoption?
Well, I don't have a clear answer for that, but I think it's still safe for us to do so because we follow our web crawler is.
Yeah, that's not the question she's asking.
Okay.
Do you think the conclusions and results you found in the public would also apply to the private if you were able to see it?
Okay.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, well,
it's hard to say without seeing it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is being careful about generalizing, right, and saying that it applies to all firmware, because since you can't see the private firmware, you don't really know, right?
So from my personal experience, I would say the private ones are not getting any better because sometimes my advisor would say if the routers of if his router in the home is broken, he's not going to improve it. Instead, he will buy another one. So only a few people are trying to customize the firmwares themselves. So the private ones is still coming from the vendor. So I don't think they will do any magic in those private data. So yeah, my experience would say no.
Yeah, that's what she's asking is intuition.
Very interesting. And then, so, getting back to, you said you're doing this, and I think you are doing it with altruistic reasons, right? You're doing it for good reasons. You want to help them make their firmware better. But then you said that you haven't reported it to the vendors. And if you haven't reported it to them, how can they learn from it and how can they improve their products?
So we have some we are trying to investigate the potential reasons why it's missing. I think if they look at in those reasons, there would be a very good starting point for them to improve. So first, I think they should use the newer version of the building tools, especially those building tools should support most of the mitigations and also the overhead. I think it's important. So for some of the device, overhead may be affordable, especially like assuming delay the network router 20% may be not acceptable, but sometimes the other devices, which is not such sensitive one, I think 20% overhead is totally fine. So for those devices, they should consider the security more. I think there is always a trade-off between the security and the overhead. So it's the vendor's decision to decide which side they want to focus more on.